This video is brought to you by Squarespace, the all-in-one website platform. More about them later in the video.
Welcome back to Geographics. I'm your host, Cosmic Horror Madman Eric Malachite, and today we're taking a deep dive into one of the Wild West's most iconic places, Tombstone. Today's script was written by Radu Alexander, so be sure to show him some love in the comments and gear up for what is a fascinating story with some familiar Western faces. And side note, is there anyone else who thinks of BattleBots whenever they hear the name Tombstone? Is it just me? Moving on. Let's get to it. The gunfight at the OK Corral lasted only 30 seconds, but ended up becoming one of the defining moments of the Wild West. It turned the people involved into legends, particularly Wyatt Earp, but also made the location where it took place famous, the town of Tombstone. With such a fitting name, Tombstone seemed the perfect place to represent the quintessential Wild West town, where cowboys spent the entire day in saloons getting drunk and playing cards, violent outlaws roamed the streets looking for a fight, and brave lawmen brought justice at the end of a barrel. But was that truly the real Tombstone? Let's find out. It all started with one man, Ed Schieffelin. During the mid-1860s, Schieffelin left the family home in Oregon to become a prospector. He roamed for a decade through Nevada, Colorado, and New Mexico in search of gold, but found little success. Then in 1877, he moved to California, hoping that some precious metals were still left for a down-on-his-luck prospector following the gold rush from a few decades earlier. As it turned out, there weren't, at least not any that he could find. Schieffelin considered it might have been time for a career change, and heard that the US Army was looking for scouts in the Arizona Territory. They had two issues to deal with: securing the border with Mexico and, more notably, fighting the Chiricahua Apaches, led by famed chiefs such as Cochise and Geronimo. Consequently, on March 3rd, 1877, Captain Samuel Marmaduke Whitside established a cavalry camp in the San Pedro Valley at the base of the Huachuca Mountains. Camp Huachuca, as it was called, was in an ideal strategic position. It had high ground and trees for protection, a supply of fresh running water, and excellent observation in three directions. It was good enough to turn into a permanent fort 5 years later, but for now, the camp had just been founded and Ed Schieffelin was among its new scouts. Not quite ready to give up on his dreams of prospecting, Schieffelin would spend his free days roaming the wilderness surrounding the camp all alone, still looking for the port at the end of the rainbow. But he kept coming back to the camp empty-handed, and eventually one of the soldiers warned Schieffelin that the only thing he would find out there in the hills would be his tombstone. Hey, they did that thing. They said the title. Then one day, fate smiled on good old Ed. He was surveying an area north of the Mule Mountains when he stumbled upon a porphyry rock protruding through the limestone. There wasn't much going on, but Schieffelin's instincts were telling him that there was a mother lode hiding somewhere beneath him. After spending the whole summer scouring the hills in vain, Ed was running a bit low on provisions. He traveled to Tucson with his ore sample, hoping to find someone who would grub stake him, and in case you're not an old-timey prospector, this meant to supply him with tools and food in exchange for a cut of the profits. He had no such luck. So instead, Ed decided to turn to family. His brother, Al Schieffelin, who at the time was a hard rock miner working at the McCracken mine about 250 miles west. Nothing if not determined, Ed pocketed his ore samples, used his last 30 cents to buy tobacco, and set off on foot for McCracken. At first, it looked like Ed walked all that way for nothing. His brother wasn't exactly impressed with his ore samples and instead offered him a job at the mine. But fate once again decided to throw Ed a bone and steered him towards an assayer in town named Dick Gerd. Gerd was able to perform a more thorough analysis of the ore, and he had some great news for the Schieffelin brothers. What Ed had there was silver, assayed out at $2,000 to the ton. The three of them struck a partnership and made their way back to the San Pedro Valley. They set up shop inside an abandoned adobe known as Brockow's Cabin, another little piece of Arizona history that was notorious in its own right because over a dozen men were supposedly killed there, including the guy who built it, Frederick Brunkow. The cabin was more amenable to Ed Schieffelin and his team, and no violence occurred while they were using it. But it wasn't all good news. It seemed that Ed's samples came from a rich but shallow pocket that was soon exhausted. But once again, Schieffelin did not give up. His gut was telling him that there was a big, juicy lode in there somewhere, just waiting to be found. It took about another week of prospecting, but Ed found it. a ledge of ore-bearing granite that gird assayed at about $15,000 to the ton of silver and $1,500 to the ton of gold. They called this lode the Lucky Cuss, but they were the real lucky cusses because they found another one. They called it the Tough Nut, and then another one they named the Grand Central, and then another one called Contention. Clearly, the men were standing on a giant deposit of silver and were about to become very rich. All that was left was to file a claim, but what to call it? Ed Schiefelin had the perfect name, naming it after the one thing people warned him he would find out there. And so on September 3rd, 1877, they filed a claim for Tombstone.
If you want your brand to become as famous as Tombstone was, then you're going to need a fancy website to get your message out. And today's sponsor, Squarespace, is just what you're looking for. Squarespace is the all-in-one website platform, perfect for entrepreneurs, whether you're a cowboy looking to start up a casino or an upstanding businessman looking to run his own saloon. Squarespace has all the tools you need to get the job done, all in one place and on your terms. With Squarespace's next-generation website engine, the Fluid Engine, you'll be able to choose from a template and customize it to your heart's content. And unlike using an expensive web designer, your website will be fully functional on desktop and mobile from the get-go. And now introducing Design Intelligence, Squarespace's brand new service that combines 2 decades of industry-leading design expertise with cutting-edge AI technology to unlock your strongest creative potential. Design Intelligence empowers anyone to build a beautiful, more personalized website tailored to their unique needs and craft a bespoke digital identity to use across one's entire online presence. And best of all, if you're looking to sell your wares on your website, Squarespace offers flexible payment options with simple but powerful tools. Accept credit cards, PayPal, and Apple Pay. And in eligible countries, your customers will have the option to buy now and pay later with Afterpay and ClearPay. Ready to get started? Check out squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/geographics to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Now back to the video.
Finding the silver was all well and good, but mining it was another matter entirely. An expensive one. One more expensive than the 3 of them could afford, so they needed partners with deep pockets. They found several men willing to invest in the operation, most notably the former governor of the Arizona Territory, Anson P.K. Stafford. With their help, the Tombstone Mine and Milling Company was soon in operation. Unsurprisingly, they couldn't keep this kind of discovery secret for long. In 1878, other prospectors came to the area to seek their fortunes. And they were followed by homesteaders, cowboys, miners, speculators, and all sorts of businessmen who saw the potential for growth. After a while, all these people got tired of sleeping in shacks, tents, and shanties every night. They needed an actual town. In March 1879, U.S. Deputy Mineral Surveyor Solonalis came and laid out the site for a new settlement on a mesa near the mines known back then as Goose Flats. And fittingly enough, they named this new town after the first mine in the area, Tombstone. As soon as Tombstone was plotted, dozens of cabins started being built. Of course, they would hardly be enough, since by fall, there were probably over 1,000 people in the area who were resigned to sleeping in camps for the foreseeable future. But most of them had no intention of living in Tombstone. They were just there for work and would go back home during the winter. Even so, there were still plenty of people eager to make Tombstone their new home. William A. Hardwood became the first mayor in December 1879. That same month, Tombstone welcomed its most notorious residents, the Earp brothers. Technically, Virgil Earp arrived first in November. A former constable in Prescott, Arizona, Virgil had been appointed as the Deputy U.S. Marshal for the Tombstone District by the Arizona Territory U.S. Marshal Crowley Dake. He was joined later by his brothers, Morgan and Wyatt Earp, who served at various points as town deputies, deputy sheriffs for Pima County, and Wyatt even succeeded his brother as Deputy U.S. Marshal. In early 1880, they were also joined by their friend Doc Holliday, but Virgil only temporarily deputized him during the gunfight at the OK Corral. But more on that a little later. For now, Tombstone was still a burgeoning town in need of more basic amenities, but it developed fast. One thing to remember is that the silver industry made Tombstone a very wealthy city, so it had no real problems attracting businesses or services. After a few years, you could find almost anything you needed in Tombstone, and we're not just talking about saloons and brothels, even though there were certainly plenty of those around. A weekly stagecoach service between Tombstone and Tucson began in late 1878 before the town had even been laid out. By early 1880, the town already had a daily mail service. It installed telephones later that year. By 1883, Tombstone had 2 ice companies, 3 water companies, 2 gas companies, a horse racing track, over a dozen restaurants, 4 churches, a school, 2 banks, a bowling alley, 5 ice cream parlors, and fresh seafood brought every day from Mexico. Tombstone even had a baseball team, and if you believe their tourism board, they installed the first swimming pool in the Arizona territory. One of its oldest sites was the Boot Hill Graveyard, a small cemetery that got its name because many of its permanent residents died with their boots on, which is kind of funny because Dodge City had a graveyard that was named the same thing for the exact same reason. The Wild West was wild, y'all. It filled up in just a few years, and by 1884, Tombstone opened a newer, bigger cemetery, but to this day, the original remains one of the city's most popular tourist attractions because many of its notorious locals are still buried there, including all the cowboys who were killed at the OK Corral. Because of its rapid development in 1881, Tombstone was appointed the county seat of the newly created Cochise County. A courthouse was built that same year, and then just a year later, a bigger one made out of red brick. This was done more out of necessity than anything else. Tombstone suffered 2 devastating fires in its early years, one in 1881 and the second in 1882. Each time, dozens of buildings were reduced to smoldering cinders, including the first courthouse, but each time, they were rebuilt bigger and better than ever, thus earning Tombstone the reputation as the town too tough to die. People who wanted to visit Tombstone had plenty of places where they could spend their hard-earned money, even if they weren't interested in booze, gambling, or prostitution, the world's oldest profession. Most of them could be found on Allen Street, the city's commercial center, named after John Pye Allen, a failed prospector turned successful pie maker. For accommodations, they had several hotels to choose from, although the Grand Hotel, opened in 1880, was one of the finest in the Arizona territory, and its guests could sleep in the same room where Wyatt Earp or Doc Holliday once stayed. For entertainment, the Birdcage Theater offered a wide array of variety acts, including comedy shows, masquerade balls, magic shows, Cornish wrestling, which was quite popular, and Mademoiselle de Granville, the woman with the iron jaw, whose specialty was lifting heavy objects with her teeth. Those with money burning a hole in their pocket who also wanted to become a small part of history could sit at the card table and play a few hands in one of the longest poker games in history. It began in 1881 with a $1,000 buy-in and continued non-stop 24/7 for 8 years, 5 months, and 3 days. Obviously, not with the same people, as players could cash out whenever they wanted, and the Birdcage got 10% of their winnings. Possibly the weirdest fact about this game is that nobody officially won it. Even though it lasted over 8 years, it ended abruptly after a flood forced the theater to close down temporarily. Individuals of a more respectable reputation who repudiated the tawdry atmosphere of the Birdcage could find something more to their liking at the Schieffelin Hall, named and built in 1881 not by Ed Schieffelin, but by his brother Al. Plays, dramas, operas, and recitals were typically on the bill, featuring some of the greatest actors, singers, and playwrights from across the world. And if you're still undecided, here is a contemporary account of a visit to Tombstone from an 1883 issue of Harper's Magazine. Tombstone is the very latest and liveliest of those mushroom civilizations in unlikely places which have been so often seen to gather helter-skelter around a find of the precious metals. A 6-horse Concorde coach carried us not too speedily over the 25 miles of dusty road to Tombstone. The coach was called the Grand Central, after a prosperous mine. At the beginning of the year 1878, there was not so much as a tent at Tombstone. The small city, 2 years old at the date of this journey, had attained a population of 2,000 and a property valuation, apart from the mines, of $1,050,980. A desirable lot of 30 by 80 feet on Allen Street between 4th and 6th was worth $6,000. A shanty that cost $50 to build rented for $15 a month. A nucleus of many blocks at the center consisted of substantial large-sized buildings, hotels, banks, Schieffelin Hall, for meetings and amusements, and stores stocked with goods of more than average excellence for even older towns. The mining claims run under the city itself. From the roof of the Grand Hotel, you look down at the shafts, the hoist works, and heaps of extracted ore of the Vizina, the Gilded Age, the Mountain Maid, and other mines opening strangely in the very midst of the buildings. The outskirts consisted still of huts and tents. A burly miner could be seen stretched upon his cot in his windowless cabin, barely large enough to contain it. There were small tents provided with wooden doors and adobe chimneys. New as it was, the business portion of the place had been swept out of existence at one time. A devastating fire had originated from a characteristic incident, the explosion of a whiskey barrel at the Oriental Saloon. But in 14 days, all had been rebuilt much better than before. I took the pains to remark the number of establishments in a single short block of Allen Street, at which intoxicating beverages could be had. There were the bar rooms of two principal hotels, the Eagle Brewery, Can Chop House, French Rotisserie Alhambra, Mason Door, City of Paris, Brown Saloon, Fashion Saloon, Miner's Home, Kelly's Winehouse, The Grotto, the Tivoli, and two saloons besides apparently unnamed. At all these places, gambling goes on without let or hindrance. A certain kind of life prevails here at Tombstone. Roulette, faro, and other games of chance are played openly in a large way in the leading saloons. There is lacking, however, the choleric, dangerous air of Tombstone. People make way for you to pass and are not exclusively preoccupied with looking for somebody to tread on the trails of their coats. The description makes it seem that even though Tombstone had some rough edges, it wasn't quite the stereotypical frontier town that the Wild West was known for. Drunken miners posed a bigger threat than gun-toting cowboys. Of course, with one major exception. And so we've reached the event that made Tombstone notorious, the gunfight at the OK Corral, or how 30 seconds on a cold October afternoon in 1881 became enshrined in Wild West lore. Before we look at the actual shootout, let's give a little background. As we said, it happened in 1881, so quite early in the town's existence. By that point, the Earp brothers had been in Tombstone for almost 2 years, with Virgil serving as town marshal, while Wyatt and Morgan were Pima County deputy sheriffs. Since their arrival, they noticed that the most dangerous men in the area were a loose association of outlaws known as the Cochise County Cowboys, or simply the Cowboys. They liked to cross the border and steal cattle in Mexico, then bring them back and sell them in the United States. There were lots of people in the Cowboys, a few hundred by Wyatt Earp's estimation, but we're only going to focus on two pairs of brothers, Ike and Billy Clanton, and Tom and Frank McClary, whose families both owned ranches near Tombstone. Ever since the Earps came into town, tensions between them and the Cowboys rose steadily, although, for the most part, the two groups resorted to taunts, scowls, and calling each other mean names. But then in April 1881, Tombstone passed a new law that forbade people from carrying deadly weapons within city limits. Everyone was supposed to deposit their guns when they entered Tombstone and pick them up again when they left. If someone forgot to do this, it was up to the marshal to disarm him. Fast forward to the night of October 25th. Ike Clanton was in Tombstone and he wasn't too happy with the Earps. Earlier that day, he had argued with Doc Holliday. Wyatt broke it up before things got violent, although Clanton did go retrieve his 6-shooter. After that, he played cards all night with Virgil Earp of all people. Virgil went to bed at around 7 a.m., but not before delivering a stern warning to Clanton not to do anything stupid. Unfortunately, Ike Clanton was feeling pretty stupid that day. Once the card game had ended, he hopped from one saloon to the other, getting drunker and more belligerent and telling anyone who would listen that today would be the day that the Earps and Holiday would get what was coming to them. Ned Boyle, the bartender at the Oriental Saloon, went and warned Wyatt, while Deputy Andy Bronk did the same to Virgil. At around noon, the Earps finally ran into Clanton, who was visibly carrying a pistol and a rifle in town. Not exactly in a calm mood, Virgil walked up to Ike and cracked him over the head with his revolver, then dragged him to the courthouse. All three Earps made it clear to him that if it was a fight he wanted, a fight he was gonna get. Clanton, however, didn't like his chances, so instead he paid the $25 fine for carrying firearms within the city limits and left. Outside the courtroom, his buddy Tom McClary was waiting for him. But he got into an argument with Wyatt Earp, who gave him a few smacks with his pistol for good measure. Later that day, their brothers Billy Clanton and Frank McClary arrived in Tombstone. Another cowboy named Billy Claiborne told them what had happened, and they were later seen going into a gun shop to buy ammo. The whole town was buzzing that afternoon. Everyone knew that something was about to go down, but nobody had any idea of the magnitude of the event. With the Cowboys packing heat and refusing to disarm, the Earps had to go confront them. Temporary Deputy Doc Holliday accompanied them, carrying a short-barreled shotgun under his coat. The two groups met on Fremont Street, because despite the name by which the shootout is remembered, the gunfight did not take place at the OK Corral, but rather in a vacant lot behind it. It's impossible to say who shot first. Different testimonies tell different things. Some say Han, others say Greedo. But nearly 30 shots were fired at close range in 30 seconds. Afterward, they literally had to wait for the smoke to settle to see who was alive and who was dead. The score stood 3-0 in favor of the Earps. Billy Clanton and the McLaury brothers were dead. Ike Clanton and Billy Claiborne, both unarmed, managed to escape before the shootout even started. Morgan Earp took a shot in the leg and Virgil one in the shoulder, while Holiday received a grazing wound to the hip. Only Wyatt Earp escaped unscathed. This was certainly not the end of the feud. Morgan Earp was later killed while leaving Schieffelin Hall, and Virgil was shot and maimed for life. In retaliation, Wyatt Earp set off on his infamous vendetta ride in which he killed 4 more cowboys. But if you want to learn about all that, you can check out the video on him on our sister channel Geographics. 30 seconds were enough to immortalize Tombstone in the history books. Without the gunfight at the OK Corral, Tombstone would likely be forgotten today. Its decline transpired almost as fast as its growth. But that's what happens when a town is completely dependent on a single industry. When the silver mining started to dry up, so did everything else. By 1890, Tombstone had almost become a ghost town, and although it had a few more brief moments of prosperity, it never recaptured its glory days. In 1911, the Tombstone Consolidated Mines Company officially went bankrupt. To add insult to injury, in 1929, the Cochise County seat was moved to Bisbee. Some estimate that during the 1930s, the town population dwindled to around 150 people. But Tombstone proudly called itself the town too tough to die, so it held on. Thanks to the popularity of westerns, America became enamored with the old adventures of the Wild West, and Tombstone had quite a story to tell. The town fully embraced its violent past and all the tourist dollars that came with it. In 1962, it was designated a National Historic Landmark as one of the best preserved specimens of the rugged frontier of the 1870s and 1880s. I hope you learned something today, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to deploy your likes, comment your favorite aspect of the Wild West, and share it with somebody who enjoys learning about the Wild West and all its fascinating landmarks. I'm Eric Malachite, and I'll see you next time, Space Cowboy.